Welcome back, everyone. This video continues our video series on Descartes' meditations by quickly discussing a rule of knowledge that Descartes proposes in the third meditation. It's what's going to be called the clear and distinct rule. So we're going to start by reviewing the knowledge that Descartes thinks he's discovered thus far leading up to the third meditation. And then we'll talk about what the clear and distinct rule is. Then we'll talk about this clear and distinct rule in relation to our ideas and external physical objects. We'll talk about this rule in relation to mathematics. And then we'll close with the task that Descartes sets himself due to this sort of reflection on the current status of this rule. So Descartes has painstakingly applied his method of doubt in the first and second meditations to reveal what he thinks is a supposed foundation of knowledge of which he can have absolute certainty. The knowledge of his own existence as a thinking thing, and knowledge of the contents of his own mind. So what thoughts he's having. So then Descartes thinks we have examples of things that we have knowledge of, certain knowledge of. And he wonders, well, can we think about those examples and sort of abstract a way to figure out what it is that can provide us with certain knowledge? And he arrives at the following. He says, "Do I not therefore know what is required for me to be certain of anything? Surely, in this first instance of knowledge, there's nothing but a certain clear and distinct perception of what I affirm. Yet this would hardly be enough to render me certain of the truth of a thing if it could ever happen that something I perceived so clearly and distinctly were false. And thus, I now seem able to posit as a general rule that everything I very clearly and distinctly perceive is true." So Descartes' proposing this rule of knowledge that we're going to call the clear and distinct rule. This rule that everything that I clearly and distinctly perceive is true. Now, when I use the word perceive there, don't think like vision. Don't think like our senses. It might even be better to say something like everything that I clearly and distinctly intuit or understand is true. So by going through that first and second meditation, the idea is Descartes thinks that he has achieved a clear and distinct understanding or intuition or perception of himself, of his thoughts and his mind, that thereby allows him to know that he exists. There's a kind of argument that Descartes sort of suggests here for the veracity of the clear and distinct rule. He seems to suggest that he has certain knowledge that he exists and that he thinks. And that knowledge, he thinks, has to come from his clear and distinct perception of himself as a thinking thing. But then he says, my clear and distinct perception couldn't provide me with certain knowledge unless it was impossible for my clear and distinct perceptions to ever be wrong. So, since I do have this certain knowledge, and it came from the clear and distinct perception, it must be impossible for my clear and distinct perceptions to ever be wrong. But you might be thinking, wait, hasn't Descartes already had what he thought were clear and distinct perceptions that ended up turning out to be doubtful? If so, then wouldn't it appear that there's a counterexample to his claim that every clear and distinct perception must be true? So he thought he had clear and distinct perceptions of the physical objects he perceived via the senses. However, his skeptical arguments from the first meditation showed him that those beliefs were subject to doubt. It was possible for the beliefs to be mistaken. And so, if he really did have a clear and distinct perception of those things, then it looks like his clear and distinct perceptions could be mistaken. But what sort of things did he think that he clearly and distinctly perceived? He says, why, the earth, the sky, the stars, and all the other things that I perceived by means of the senses. But what was it about these things that I clearly perceived? Surely the fact that the ideas or thoughts of these things were hovering before my mind. But even now I do not deny that these ideas are in me. Yet there was something else I used to affirm, which, owing to my habitual tendency to believe it, I used to think was something I clearly perceived, even though I actually did not perceive it at all. Namely, that certain things existed outside me, things from which those ideas proceeded and which those ideas completely resembled. But on this point I was mistaken. Or rather, if my judgment was a true one, it was not the result of the force of my perception. So what Descartes is saying here is that, look, there's two things. There's this idea or experience of the tree in my mind, and there's this belief that there's a tree out there in the world. He says, the tree out there in the world is doubtful. I used to think that it was a clear and distinct perception, but in fact it was not. It only felt that way because I had this clear and distinct perception of a tree in my mind, plus a sort of natural habit to always form the belief that the idea in my mind that I clearly and distinctly perceived was being caused by a physical object outside my mind that sort of resembled exactly the idea that I sort of saw in my mind. So my belief about that tree outside my mind, that was not a clear and distinct perception. Instead, the clear and distinct perception I had was merely the tree as I experience it in my mind. Well, what should we say about mathematical beliefs? That was another theme that came up. He says, look, when I consider something very simple and easy in the areas of arithmetic or geometry, for example, that 2 plus 3 make 5, did I not intuit them at least clearly enough so as to affirm them as true? And he says, whenever I turn my attention to those very things that I think I perceive with such great clarity, I'm so persuaded by them. So he has such a sort of clear and distinct perception of this thought that 2 plus 3 makes 5, that when he thinks about that sort of claim, he spontaneously blurts out these words, "Let him who can deceive me. He will never bring it about that perhaps 2 plus 3 might equal more or less than 5. But whenever this preconceived opinion about the supreme power of God occurs to me, he says, I cannot help admitting that, were he to wish it, it would be easy for him to cause me to err even in those matters that I think I intuit as clearly as possible with the eyes of the mind. So he says, look, when I'm thinking about 2 plus 3 equals 5, it seems clear and distinct, so much so that I can't help but believe it. But then when I start thinking about the idea of an all-powerful God, an all-powerful God would have the power to do absolutely anything, including give me sort of faculties where I try to add 2 and 3 and I always go wrong, where even the things that I think I clearly and distinctly perceive, I'm mistaken. So I have no reason to believe that there's an all-powerful sort of evil genius hell-bent on deceiving me. And so he says, yes, there is some potential doubt here, but it's very tenuous and, so to speak, metaphysical. So Descartes is revealing in this passage that he has not established the clear and distinct rule as true yet. The evil genius hypothesis gives us some reason to doubt, even if it's sort of a tentative sliver of doubt, that everything we clearly and distinctly perceive is actually true. So he says, but in order to remove even this basis for doubt, so in order to have certain knowledge that those things that he clearly and distinctly perceives are actually true, he needs to inquire whether there is a God, and if there is, whether or not he can be a deceiver. It says, for if I'm ignorant of this, if he's not able to prove that, if he's not able to know that, he thinks I'm never capable of being completely certain about anything else. This doubt will sort of hover over him in anything else he believes. So in order to gain any further knowledge, such as knowledge of mathematics or of empirical science, Descartes thinks he needs to construct a proof of a non-deceiving God. But he has to do that using only premises that appeal to the knowledge that he has so far discovered. He can only appeal to clear and distinct perceptions of his own mind and the ideas that he finds in his own mind. That seems like quite the challenge. In the next few videos, we're going to investigate how Descartes tries to do this and the kinds of problems he's going to run into. See you then.